Some of you may know that I live in Oulu, moving here some 10 years ago. Looking at the history of this beautiful city has been a fulfilling hobby for me. A few years ago, I was doing some research on the Battle of Oulu, and I came across a mention that the commander of Oulu's Red Guard, Lennart Lindgren, had fought in the Second Boer War. This led me on a journey to the Skandinaviska Karen, otherwise translated to Scandinavian Corps, and the heroics of the Battle of Magersfontein. The Second Boer War between the British Empire and the two Boer states of the South African Republic, also more commonly known as the Republic of Transvaal, which I'll use for the rest of this episode, and the Orange Free State, is a long and complex subject outside the scope of this episode. But the immediate issue that led to open war was the control of the Witwatersrand gold mines. The discovery of gold led to a rush of foreigners, Uitlanders in the local dialect. It wasn't long before tensions between the majority British Uitlanders and the local Boers rose. The Transvaal government, fearful of British expansion and the high influx of British migrant workers that would eventually tip the balance of power away from the Boers, passed legislation in 1890 that refused voting rights to Uitlanders who had not been resident for 14 years. There was also increased taxation. These acts put more tension on an already strained situation and in some cases led to violence. In response to these measures, the British Colonial Secretary, Joseph Chamberlain, in September 1899 demanded that the Transvaal government grant full voting rights and representation to Uitlanders, but was rebuffed with an ultimatum that the British remove all troops from the border within 48 hours or the South African Republic and the Orange Free State would be forced to declare war. The British rejected the ultimatum, despite only having a small contingent of troops in the border region. This led to the Boer republics declaring war on the 11th of October 1899 and ordering their troops, who had been mobilised on the border from early September, to launch strikes in the British Natal and Cape Colony areas. So where does the Scandinavian Corps come in? Immigrants from the Nordic countries had been coming to South Africa since the 1700s, many looking for adventure and fortune. The land was suited to the trades of the Nordic peoples such as forestry, fishing, whaling, and many shipping companies like the Swedish and Norwegian East Indian trade companies set up headquarters in the region. By the 1800s, the mining industry was booming in Transvaal, and this attracted hundreds more from the Nordic nations. By the time of the Boer War, there was an estimated 1,500 Nordic settlers in the republics. Another area that saw an influx of Uitlanders was missionaries. Many were of Swedish origin, like Otto Witt of the famous Rorke's Drift. Today, there are still small communities that maintain some cultural ties with their ancestral lands. For example, in Durban, there is still occasional festivals with Norwegian links, as well as a Norwegian museum. So with a relatively large number of Nordic peoples in the region, Swedish engineer Axel Uola set up the Skandinaviska Organisationen, or the Scandinavian Organization, in the spring of 1899. The primary aim was to help incoming Nordic people find work and support those unemployed members of the community. With the clear agitation between the Boer republics and the British Empire, the organization attempted to draw a line regarding the sympathies amongst the members. But it amounted to nothing, as there were significant supporters on both sides. However, when war broke out, the organisation met again, and now there was a clear, overwhelming support for the Boer cause. By the conclusion of the meeting, it was decided that a volunteer unit would be raised and offered to serve with the Transvaal militia. 68 men volunteered straight away, and the organisation officially offered the unit to the Transvaal government. The government graciously accepted the unit and provided the volunteers with firearms and 90 horses. The organisation purchased suitable clothing and additional supplies for the men. The volunteers would not receive any form of salary, but were promised citizenship rights and guaranteed a plot of land upon the conclusion of the war. As were common in Boer units, the officers and NCOs were elected by the men. Mr. Uola had wanted to be part of the unit, but his employers at the railway company had ordered him to convert the railway workshops into weapons factories. Johannes Flygaard, often mistakenly called Finnish, but was in fact the Natal-born son of Swedish missionaries, was elected to become captain of the Scandinavian Corps. He was able to speak Afrikaans, as well as several other languages, knew the land due to his job as a government land surveyor, and had participated in military actions against local African tribes, an ideal choice to lead the unit. Amongst the volunteers, between 13 to 19 Finns joined the Corps. Sources give differing numbers. These formed their own troop, with Johan Wiklund elected as sergeant. While the men displayed enthusiasm and interest, many were lacking in the soldiering department. Most hadn't held a firearm before, nor knew how to ride a horse. The training was made even more difficult as only Lieutenant Erik Stalberg had any formal military training, as a former warrant officer in the Royal Swedish Army. With only a few days of basic training under their belt, the Corps was paraded in front of President Kruger and ordered to help Boer forces at the siege of Mafeking. Their journey took longer than expected due to their lack of riding skills, but they did arrive at their rendezvous with one of the famous Boer long-tom guns and escorted it to where General Piet Cronje's force was laying siege. Having gotten to the battleground, the Corps was eager to prove themselves. They wouldn't have to wait long, as General Cronje ordered an assault on the town, and soon 100 men of the Corps were advancing alongside 1,000 of their Boer companions. In spite of their enthusiasm, the offensive was unable to break the British defences and was called off with heavy losses. The Corps saw its first casualties: a Danish man called Clausen and a Finnish volunteer, Jacob Johansson. Clausen appears to have been evacuated from the field of battle, his name no longer appearing on records after this date. Johansson, though, was offered to be sent to a hospital in Pretoria, but he refused and stayed with the unit. General Cronje didn't want to suffer vain losses, and so settled into a prolonged siege with only small-scale skirmishes and raids. The Scandinavians were noted for their almost foolhardy bravado, volunteering for numerous raids, cattle stealing, mine clearance, and other dangerous tasks. This is exemplified by an action taken by Captain Flygard, who led a small party to infiltrate British lines and cut off the British artillery position at a place called Kannenkopje. Upon finding this out, the British launched a counterattack and forced the invaders from their positions after a hard fight. The Boers were putting severe pressure upon the British border region with the sieges of Ladysmith, Mafeking and Kimberley, but the British were starting to recover from the shock of the rapid Boer strike. Soon, a strong British force under Lord Methuen was sent to relieve Kimberley. General Cronje was ordered to take his force and prevent this from happening. The Scandinavians arrived at Magersfontein on the 28th of November, showing a massive improvement in their horse handling skills. General Cronje also presented the Corps with a gift, a donkey wagon loaded with explosives, and asked that they mine the railway line. A group of 10 volunteers led by 2 Finns completed their assignment with great skill, mining the railway line in several places, causing delay to the advancing British troops. It was decided to make a stand at Magersfontein. Generals Cronje and Coos de la Rey put their combined force to work on building defences around the hills. They knew that the British were on their way, but that they had a chance to give a sufficient blow to their foe. On the evening of the 10th of December, around half the Scandinavian Corps were at an advanced outpost around 1.5 kilometres in front of the main defence line. Unbeknownst to the volunteers at the outpost, the British forces were preparing for an assault against the Boer defensive line. In the early hours of the 11th, Lord Methuen ordered his force to start their advance. When news of the advance reached General Cronje, he ordered that the outpost be abandoned and those troops within to fall back to the defence line. Either through miscommunication or the Scandinavian zeal, the outpost occupied by the volunteers failed to retreat. The British surrounded the position and a firefight ensued. The first British assault was thrown back, but the small detachment was no match for the overwhelming numbers of the British. The second attack came soon after 6 a.m. The fighting was brutal, mostly conducted at short range with bayonets and knives. By the end of the hour, the outpost was in British hands, and 20 volunteers were dead, Captain Flygard among them. Lieutenant Stalberg had suffered 3 wounds during the fighting before he lost consciousness. 21 volunteers were taken prisoner. Almost everyone was wounded. 4 volunteers had followed Lieutenant Stalberg's final order and abandoned the outpost and made it back to the Boer lines. 7 others who were severely wounded were left behind, but were later recovered by the Boer forces. The battle wasn't over with the fall of the Scandinavian outpost. The main British advance was caught in an ambush only 370 metres from the main Boer lines. The battle degraded into a bloodbath for the British forces. Even with reinforcements and artillery support, the British were unable to break the Boer lines and eventually forced to retreat. As for the other half of the Scandinavian Corps, they had fought at the main defensive line. As the evening came and the last of the British left the battlefield, they counted their losses. Lieutenant Quartermaster Appelgren was mortally wounded and died a few days later. Several others were wounded, some severely. The Finns lost between 1 to 3 men depending on the source, 4 wounded, 2 of them being taken prisoner of war. General Cronje praised the men of the Corps in his report, saying, "Next to God, we can thank the Scandinavians for our victory." The Boer victory at Magersfontein was one of 3 major victories achieved during a single week, the others being Stromberg and Colenso. The blow to the British military's prestige was heavy. British public opinion turned sour. The event became known as Black Week and forced the British High Command to reassess their strategy and opinions, their story being published throughout the republics, and many wanted these brave men to be fully integrated into their Boer commando. This was not to be the case though, as Mr. Uola had continued recruiting, and as the year changed, the Corps was reinforced, and a new captain, Danish volunteer Jens Fries, was elected. The British reorganized, and soon were on the advance again. It wasn't long before General Cronje was forced to retreat as his lines of communication were cut. The retreat northwards was slow, especially for the Scandinavian Corps, as they had unfortunately lost most of their horses. British cavalry continually harassed the column, leading to several losses, including 3 for the Scandinavians. It was towards the end of their retreat that the Scandinavians suffered a devastating blow. While resting, a British force attacked them. Even though the assault was repulsed, the supply wagon was destroyed, costing the Corps most of its supplies and equipment. 2 volunteers were killed, and 3 were captured, including Sergeant Wiklund of the Finnish troop. A few days later, the column found itself fired upon by a large cavalry formation under General John French. General Cronje ordered the formation into Lager and to erect defences. The British, sensing victory over an enemy formation, sent several frontal assaults against the wagons, but they were pushed back every time with heavy losses. But the Boers were suffering too. Many of their wagons were destroyed and their ammunition was running dangerously low. The forlorn Boers stubbornly held out for over a week under intense bombardment and assault. On the morning of the 27th of February, the demoralized Boers awoke to find themselves totally surrounded by the men of the Royal Canadian Regiment of Infantry. Cronje had no choice but to surrender. The remaining 47 volunteers were taken as prisoners of war and sent to Cape Town for processing. 3, though, did manage to escape during the transport. The British still had a fight on their hands. After a hard advance, the capitals of the 2 states, Pretoria and Bloemfontein, fell to the British, and by September, all Boer territory, except for pockets in the mountainous northern area of Transvaal, was under British military control. This control was limited though, as the Boers switched to a guerrilla strategy which lasted for nearly 2 years before peace was finally signed. The tropical island of St. Helena was turned into a giant prisoner of war camp in the wake of the large numbers of prisoners captured during the Boer War. It was the ideal place to house them, as the chances of them escaping and returning to the fight was extremely slim. Most of the Finns were sent here and spent many months before being freed. It seems that there was a big split in what the now free men did. Some returned to Finland, but others immigrated to the United States. However, not all those taken prisoners survived. Mats Lagnus and Johan Johansson died during their stay, most likely of the wounds they received during the battles they fought in. But what did the war mean for the Finns? The Second War of Freedom, as it is known in some circles, occupied a special place in the hearts of many Finns. At the time, the Finnish nation was under the firm heel of the Russian Empire. The February Manifesto of 1899 was threatening the long-held freedoms that the Finns of the Grand Duchy had enjoyed for so long. When the Boers rejected the demands of the British Empire and hostilities commenced, the Finnish people looked to them with not only sympathy, but also as an example of how small nations can resist much larger ones. The Boers' struggle gave the Finns hope for their own struggles. The majority of newspapers took a pro-Boer slant in their reporting of the conflict. However, this stance was more in regards to using the example of the Boers' plight as a facsimile for their own struggle. Many within Finland regarded Britain as a fair nation, and this is shown through articles expressing Britain as a supporter of Finland. Though, as the stories of concentration camps and the devastation to the countryside reached Finland, public opinion swiftly turned anti-British. The fighting carried out by the Boers was studied by many in the military world, and Finland wasn't an exception, but it took a more clandestine form. There were underground resistance movements that took the lessons of the Boer War and applied them to their situation. Former lieutenant of the Finnish Guards Battalion, now a member of the Fennoman movement, Arvid Neovius, wrote how the underground movement needed to adopt intellectual guerrilla warfare, modelled after the Boers' effective hit-and-run tactics. The national anthem of the Transvaal was translated into Finnish and sang as a protest song. In the wake of the Boer War, there was much interest to commemorate the battles that had been fought. Swedish officer Erland Mossberg, who had served with the British forces during the war, took the initiative for the memorial to be erected for the Scandinavian Corps. It wasn't long before there were enough donations for the memorial. A 6.5 metre high stele with 4 cornerstones representing the different Scandinavian countries was dedicated on the 25th of April 1908 by Louis Botha, the first Prime Minister of the Union of South Africa. On the 25th anniversary of the Battle of Magersfontein, a special ceremony was held at the Officers' Club in Helsinki. In attendance were representatives of both the military and the state. The story of how a handful of hastily trained Finnish riflemen, alongside their Nordic brothers, held up a battle-hardened British unit was related to the assembled crowd. The Siirtolaisuus, the civil guard, had sent a wreath with blue and white ribbons to be laid at the site of the battle. The entire event was covered by articles in the newspapers. The following year saw a shooting competition named the Memory of Magersfontein held in Helsinki. Until the wars of 1939 to 1945, the Finnish volunteers in the Boer War were well remembered. Their story was seen as relevant and of merit to the larger story of Finland's fight for freedom. However, as Finland was fighting for its independence during the Winter and Continuation Wars, the story of a handful of Finns fighting in Africa was forgotten. Thank you all for listening and supporting the show. Sources used are in the description. I want to say a big thank you to those who have supported me through Patreon. Their names are now immortalised on the Roll of Honour. I also want to say thank you to the numerous comments and messages I have received. Your encouragement is appreciated. I have taken several of your suggestions on board and hope this will improve upon my content. Don't forget you can visit www.finlandatwar.com for regular articles. Until next time, kiitos ja heippa.